Today we're going to begin a new series of lessons asking the question, why do we? And so we're going to go a lot of different places with this. Primarily the focus is going to be on things dealing with worship and our service to God, but we may enter into things to deal with our day-to-day life as well. Why do we do these things and not these things is going to be what we want to focus on. And so, as often when I start a series, ask me when I'm done, when the series is going to be done, because I don't know. We'll figure that out as we go along. I really don't know the whole scope and detail of the series yet, but we will continue on until it seems the appropriate time to not continue on with that series. Now, having said that, it's not going to be a week after week type series. We're not going to approach it this way. About one Sunday a month, we're going to have a sermon that focuses on why do we, and then we're going to intersperse other material, other lessons in the weeks between those. And so this week, we want to begin by looking at the question of why do we sing in worship? That's stating it in the positive. The negative is, why don't we have instrumental music? Why aren't we using instruments in our worship as we praise God in song? And, it's not for lack of having people who are skilled at playing instruments. There's a few people in the crowd today who I know are quite skilled at playing instruments, at playing guitar in particular. We've had people in the past worshiping with us who were skilled pianists, who was a piano teacher. Don't look at me for musical skill with an instrument, learning to play guitar, but emphasis on learning. And also don't look at me for vocal skill either. But anyhow, that's besides the point. But it's not because we don't have or haven't had people who have musical ability. That's not the reason. What needs to be the reason is we need to study the Bible, and we need to find out, what does God say in his word about worship? And so why do we sing in worship as opposed to have instrumental music? The simplest answer is the New Testament tells us to. When we go into the New Testament, what we see time and again of the people when they're praising God in song is that they were using their voices. In fact, there are 9 times in the New Testament that worship of God in song is spoken about, and every time you're going to see the word sing. But equally, none of those times, and in fact, in no New Testament text, will you ever see that instrumental music was used in the worship of God. And so that ought to tell us something. And so we're going to talk about it a little bit. So let's bring some of these up. So Acts chapter 16 and at verse 25 is one of those texts. Paul and Silas were in a Philippian jail here. And so at midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God. Now, I understand that there's no opportunity for them to be using an instrument unless they've got one in their back pocket. They likely don't have an instrument available to them in a jail in Philippi. But Paul, when he is instructing the church at Corinth, in 1 Corinthians chapter 14 and at verse 15, and he's specifically instructing them about worship in the context, he says, what is the conclusion then? I will pray with the Spirit, and I will also pray with the understanding. I will sing with the Spirit, and I will also sing with the understanding. And so as he's talking about worship in the assembly of God's people, that's what's going on in 1 Corinthians chapter 14. He says that I'm going to sing with the Spirit. I'm going to sing with the understanding. No reference at all to the use of instruments in what he says. In Ephesians chapter 5 and at verse 19, the same is true there. It's a context dealing with worship of God. And he says that they are to be speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord. Similar to that text, in fact, I believe it's a parallel text to it out of Colossians chapter 3. Verse 16, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with grace in your hearts to the Lord. And we'll add one more. We've got room on this page, so we'll add one more. James chapter 5 and verse 13. Is anyone cheerful? Let him sing psalms. This is James, the Lord's brother. And in fact, I don't think James in this context is dealing with collective worship like we have done this morning, but rather private worship. He doesn't say, are all of the saints cheerful? Then let them sing songs. He says, is anyone cheerful? This is an individual thing. And so in private worship, let him sing psalms is the response that James gives. And so time and again, the New Testament says that we are to sing. Now, I want us to focus on some key words out of the text that we have on the screen here, apart from the obvious word sing that appears in the text. And so in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 15, notice the word understanding. He says, I will sing with the Spirit, I will also sing with the understanding. This word understanding, the English Standard Version would render it this way. I will pray with my spirit, and I will also pray with my mind. I will sing praise with my spirit. I will sing with my mind also. Uses the word mind there instead of understanding. It's the Greek word nous, which is actually referring to our mind. And so, our minds need to be engaged in worship. Why? Because singing involves words, and we need to be focused on the words. It's the same word that we used last week in our lesson from Ephesians chapter 4, be renewed in the spirit of your mind. It's the use of our ability to contemplate and to think on things and to mull things over in our mind. And so when we're singing, we need to focus on the tune to some degree so that it sounds nice. That's good to have it sound nice. But really the focus is the words. The words are what are important when we are singing praise to God. It's what we find in the words. And that's really what we see in these other key words. And so in Ephesians chapter 5, speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, it's about the words that are being stated. It's about the words that we are singing. We are speaking or saying these to one another, ways to encourage each other, talking about the goodness of God and the things of God. And so as much as it's great to hear a well-sung tune, the words are what are going to build us up spiritually. And so we need to be focused on what we are saying, what we are speaking. Over in Colossians chapter 3, notice the first word there, teaching. We are to be teaching one another in song. Now, listening to a guitar, listening to a piano, it's beautiful. If it's played right, it sounds wonderful. But what does that teach? The instrument itself can't teach you anything. You can be taught to play an instrument, that's one thing. But the instrument is incapable of teaching, whereas when we speak, when we sing together, there is teaching going on. We are teaching one another. And not only teaching, but he also uses the word admonishing. This means to put in mind, to caution, to reprove, to gently warn. And so when we sing songs that deal with the manner of a Christian life, if we're not living that way, we're being warned by our brethren in song. We need to change the way that we're living. We need to live God's way. And so let me suggest to you, with our voice, we can do all of these things, that we can sing with understanding or with our mind. We can speak and we can teach and we can admonish. But with an instrument, we can do none of those. An instrument cannot. It has nothing to do with our thought process. It has nothing to do with speaking or teaching or admonishing. Instrumental music does not fulfill any of these verses and what we see God saying. This is how worship is to be. This is the nature of worship in song. And so our voice engages in all of those, whereas an instrument does not. Now, I said there are 9 verses in the New Testament that specifically address it. We've got 5, so let's bring the others up. And so chapter 14, verse 26, and Matthew 26, verse 30, they're exactly the same, verbatim. Word for word, they are the same, and so I'll put them together. when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. This is, of course, Jesus and his apostles on the night that he would be betrayed. They had shared the Passover feast together. They sang a hymn, and then out they went. It is worth noting that this is not actually about New Testament worship. This is Jesus and the apostles, who were all Jews, observing the Passover, which was a Jewish feast, and before Jesus died, which was the beginning of the new covenant. And so this is actually Jewish worship. This is worship that would be under the law of Moses. And there are occasions when you will go back to the Old Testament and you will see instrumental music being used in worship, being commanded by God to be used in worship. But I think it's interesting that the only occasion of Jewish worship in song that is recorded in the New Testament is an occasion when they did not use instrumental music. If for no other reason, just simply that it doesn't cause any confusion then. Oh, well, hang on, there's a text over in Matthew where they used instruments. No, there isn't. Because the Lord used an occasion where they did not use instruments. And that's the only time of Old Testament worship and song that is recorded for us in the New Testament. Really what we see here is the Spirit giving us a consistent message throughout the entire New Testament. All right, two other occasions where worship in music is mentioned. Romans chapter 15, verse 8 and 9, and then Hebrews chapter 2, verse 11 and 12. So Romans 15, verse 8 and 9. Now I say that Jesus Christ has become a servant to the circumcision for the truth of God, to confirm the promises made to the fathers, and that the Gentiles might glorify God for his mercy. As it is written, for this reason I will confess to you among the Gentiles and sing to your name. Now, we're not going to dig into Romans 15 and the meaning of Romans 15 and so forth. That's for another time and another discussion. But what we have in this text is it speaks about Christ and his relationship to Christians. That's really what the text is coming down to. And in particular, we see the Gentiles being brought in, right? Because Jew and Gentile brought together in one body, that is the church. And so it's Paul pulling from an Old Testament prophecy to talk about that relationship which would be established. And so as he brings from the Old Testament, for this reason I will confess to you among the Gentiles and sing to your name, is a quote from Psalm 18 and verse 49. There are Old Testament texts that talk about worship of God and include instruments. And yet here the Spirit of God had the Apostle Paul use a text that only mentions sing. Again, I believe the Spirit is giving us a consistent message throughout the New Testament. And then Hebrews chapter 2, verse 11 and 12, for both he who sanctifies and those who are being sanctified are all one, for which reason he is not ashamed to call them brethren, saying, I will declare your name to my brethren. In the midst of the assembly, I will sing praise to you. He's quoting from Psalm 22 in the latter part of this text. And so again, there are countless psalms that speak about all manner of instrumental music and talk about the use of instruments in worship of God. But we have this uniform and constant message that is given in the New Testament, including texts that reference Old Testament worship and that quote from the Old Testament, and that is sing. That's the consistent message that is given from start to finish in the New Testament. All right, so I want us to start talking about some objections that people might raise. And so the first one, and I've heard this a lot, but God didn't say we couldn't. No, I get what you're saying, preacher. There's verses that say sing. Okay, I heard you. But God didn't say we couldn't play instruments, and so maybe it's okay. Now, that is true. God did not say that we couldn't. I cannot take you to a text in the New Testament that says, thou shalt not use instrumental music in worship. That verse does not exist. And so God didn't say that we couldn't. But God didn't say we couldn't is a very presumptive form of reasoning when we are trying to decide what we ought to do in our service to God. God didn't say we couldn't. Well, we took the Lord's Supper this morning. God didn't say that we couldn't use root beer and potato chips, right? Show me the verse that says, thou shalt not use root beer and potato chips for the Lord's Supper. It's not there. And yet we didn't use root beer and potato chips, nor are we ever going to use root beer and potato chips. He told us what he wants us to use. He told us that he wants us to have bread and the fruit of the vine. And we have examples of the first century church using bread and the fruit of the vine. And how dare we come to God and say, well, you didn't say that we couldn't use root beer and potato chips, therefore we thought that'd be okay, right? It is the exact same reasoning. If we would change and use instrumental music in our worship, then we might as well get rid of the bread and the fruit of the vine and use root beer and potato chips. Don't you like the taste of those better, right? But it's not about our taste. It's not about what we desire. It's about what God wants us to do. God does not need to give a negative statement for everything that we are not to do. Those of you who are parents understand you do not have to go through an entire list of everything that your children are not allowed to do. When you give them an affirmative statement, you tell them what they are supposed to do. You don't need to give, and you're not doing this and not doing this and not doing this and not doing this. Now, some kids, you might have to say that to them, right? But you shouldn't have to. You should be able to tell them exactly what they're going to do, and they do it. And that's what God did with regard to the Lord's table. He told us what to use. He revealed it, and so we don't use anything else than what he told us to. And he did the very same thing when it comes to instrumental music. He didn't tell us to use that. He told us what we should use. He told us to use our voice. He told us to sing. 9 times he told us to sing. Do you know that there are more occasions in the New Testament where God told us what to do so far as worship in song than there are that God told us what to do with regard to the Lord's table? There are more times that he told us to sing than he said anything about unleavened bread and fruit of the vine. So why is the Lord's table not an issue for people, but instrumental music is? I don't understand. Well, I do understand. It's about desire. It's about what people want to do themselves. But God didn't have to. He told us what to use. He told us to use our voice. And therefore we do that. We understand that in day-to-day life, we get that. If we're at work and our boss tells us what we ought to do, then our boss doesn't have to tell us all the things that we shouldn't do. They told us what we should do. They told us what our job was. And we don't address anything else in life with that. Well, he didn't say I couldn't. We don't deal with life that way. So let's not deal with God that way either. This is something that is important for us to understand, that God's silence is authoritative. We look at commands and we understand commands are authoritative, but silence is also authoritative. Let me give you an illustration. Your mother gives you a $20 bill, tells you to go down to the store, get a carton of eggs and a loaf of bread. What do? You go down to the store, you get a carton of eggs, you get a loaf of bread, you get potato chips, you get a chocolate bar, you get a soda. Then you come home and you get in trouble, right? Because you were supposed to get a carton of eggs and a loaf of bread and then bring those back to mom with her change. She does not have to tell you, don't get this, this, and this, right? Her silence is authoritative. She did not say anything about how to spend the money beyond a carton of eggs and a loaf of bread. And so that's what you go spend the money on. You don't have the right to spend it on anything else. We get that. Here in Kingston, we've got RMC over here, and we've got some folks who are associated with the Army here, and we've in the past had some RMC cadets who have worshiped with us. If the commanding officer of a group of cadets has them out on the parade square and calls them to attention, and then their commanding officer walks off the parade square and out of sight, what do those cadets have the right to do? Stand at attention. That's it. Stand at attention. It doesn't matter that the commanding officer is not standing in front of them anymore. They were told to stand at attention. That was the last command. And in the absence of any other commands, in the silence of any other commands, that is exactly what they do. We get that. We understand that in day-to-day life. Let me tell you about Leviticus chapter 10. In Leviticus chapter 10, we've got Nadab and Abihu, who are two sons of Aaron. They are priests. They are excited to worship God, right? This is the very beginning of Jewish worship. And so we're told that Nadab and Abihu, sons of Aaron, this is Leviticus 10, verse 1 and 2, each took his censer and put fire in it, put incense on it, and offered profane fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. So fire went out from the Lord and devoured them, and they died before the Lord. Now, they did not want to do something that upset God. That was not their intent. They were excited to worship. They wanted to burn incense before the Lord. Incense is representative of our prayers when we bring it over into the New Testament. You know, that's sort of the idea. And so they wanted to burn incense to the Lord, but we're told they offered profane fire. The word profane there could otherwise be translated as strange fire. In fact, the King James Version says strange fire instead of profane. They did not go to the local garbage dump, get some fire from there, and bring that and think that somehow this would be acceptable for worship of God. That's not what happened. In fact, the verse tells us what the problem was. The fire which they got was something which the Lord had not commanded them. Oh, okay. So they went above God's commands or outside of God's commands. In fact, they are like those young cadets on the parade square waiting for the next command. Because up till this point in Leviticus, God hadn't said where to get the fire from. They knew about the censer, they knew about the incense, but they didn't know where to get the fire from. And if they had just been patient, and if they had waited till Leviticus chapter 16, that's where they find out where to get the fire from. But they acted presumptuously. They acted without authority. They acted when God was silent, and they disregarded the authority of God's silence. And so we need to learn to respect the silence of God. It is authoritative. All right, another objection that is often brought up is, well, instruments were okay in the Old Testament, so they should be okay now, right? We see them back there in the Old Testament, and so that should be fine now. Well, the Old Testament also had the lighting of candles, the burning of incense, animal sacrifices, among other things. And so how do we decide what we bring forward and what we leave, right? If the Old Testament is where we're getting the authority for it from, and that's what some are saying, well, how do we decide? Okay, instruments are okay, but animal sacrifice isn't. Lighting candles is okay, but burning incense isn't. How do we make that decision, right? And, well, the law is not our law. It's for the Jews. It was given for the Jews. There are a bunch of differences between Old Testament worship and New Testament worship. There's a different day. They worshiped on the Sabbath. We're not worshiping on the Sabbath. This is the first day of the week. Yesterday was the Sabbath. But Christians are commanded in the New Testament to worship on the first day of the week. They had a different priesthood. Well, why don't we just bring forward a priesthood? Why don't we have a Levitical priesthood or something like that? Well, because that was part of Jewish worship. The priesthood today is all Christians. There is no division of clergy and laity or anything of that sort found in the New Testament. They had different sacrifices. They had their animal sacrifices. We've got Jesus, who was our sacrifice. They had different feasts and memorials. We don't keep those. We keep the Lord's Supper. There are just all kinds of differences between Judaism and Christianity, and one of those differences is the use of instrumental music in worship. Now remember, Colossians 3:16 was one of we had looked at it. It commanded us that we were to sing, right? One verse later, look at what Paul says. Whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. We need to seek authority from Jesus, not from Moses, not from David. We need authority from Jesus. What do we find in the New Testament? That is what Paul is saying here. We need to find authority from Jesus for everything we do, including worship. And again, the previous verse, he said, sing. That's what verse 16 told us. Teach one another, teach and admonish one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. All right. Another common objection is, but the Greek says. I don't know if you've ever heard that or not. Preachers hear that kind of thing all the time. But the Greek says this, right? The Greek says that we should play. The Greek talks about the strumming of an instrument. Again, preachers often will make this argument. The Greek word in question is the Greek word psallo. Now, I don't expect you to remember all the Greek stuff. That's neither here nor there, really. But I want you to understand that there's a problem with the argument that's being made. The Greek word psallo is defined by Strong's Concordance as to twitch or twang to play on a stringed instrument. Well, there you have it right there, right? It said to play on a stringed instrument. That's what Mr. Strong said. And so we should play on a stringed instrument in worship. Now, the Greek language, I'm not discounting the Greek language. It is an important language. The New Testament was written in Greek. And understanding portions of Greek is helpful. I've got a friend who studied recently, and he's now able to read the New Testament in Greek. I wish I could do that. I can't. But you don't need to be able to read the New Testament in Greek to understand what the New Testament is saying. But some will make this argument, and we need to address it. So, over time, the meaning of words changes. We understand that, right? That happens in English. That happens in every language. It happens in Greek as well. Did you know that the word bully used to mean something of the nature of sweetheart? If you're calling somebody a bully today, you're not referring to them as a sweetheart, right? But that's what the word bully used to mean. The word awful. The word awful used to mean worthy of awe. That is not how we use it today. If something is awful, it's bad, really, really bad, right? The word gay used to mean happy or excited. It doesn't mean that anymore, right? Words change over time. And that is true when it comes to Greek words as well. We talked about this Wednesday night. The word baptizo in Greek, which we get our English word baptism from, means to immerse, right? But, excuse me, that's not the word we were talking about. That's another conversation. What was the word we were talking about? Was it this one? No. Gospel, the word gospel. We talked about the word gospel. Yeah. Gospel means good news, right? And it used to mean any good news. Babies being born, that's good news. Got a promotion, that's good news. It's a sunny day, that's good news, right? But then it became narrowed in its approach, and it's just about Jesus, the gospel of Jesus Christ. Words change over time, and we understand that. Well, the same is true with regard to the Greek word psallo. So the Greek word psallo actually appears in 4 of the texts that we've referenced already. I've highlighted is that green?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I'm colorblind. So I knew I highlighted, I just couldn't remember what the color was. So making melody in Ephesians 5:19 is the word psallo. And then Romans 15 verse 9, the word sing comes from the word psallo. Twice in 1 Corinthians 14, the word sing is coming from psallo. And then again, sing psalms in James chapter 5 and verse 13. So as much as Strong says to play a stringed instrument, well, yeah, that's the old meaning of psallo. That's what it used to mean. But it's being translated as make melody, sing psalms, right? And here's the thing. I looked at 37 translations. It's not like I camped out on one translation. I looked at 37 translations, old translations, new translations, literal translations, paraphrase translations, and consistently the word psallo is translated as sing. Why did all these translators do that? Well, that's because that's what it means. Strong's is giving an old definition. Strong's is defining the word bully as sweetheart. To make to try and change the course of things, I suppose, maybe. I don't know why. But consistently, it is translated as sing. 37 translations do that. And I stopped at 37. I could have kept going, but it just seemed prudent to stop, maybe at 37. So another interesting note, speaking about Greek, did you know that Orthodox churches traditionally do not use instrumental music? Because they understand Greek. And so they don't use instrumental music. They know what solo means. All right, last little bit, and the lesson is yours. Very quick history lesson for us. Now, I'm going to give a few quotes here from 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century people, and then some denominational leaders from the 1500s to 1800s. These are not authoritative. This is not the Bible, but this tells us what the early church was doing, and it tells us where denominational groups were at one point. And so let's start with Clemont of Alexandria. He lived between 150 and 216 AD, and he makes this statement. He says, "Leave the pipe to the shepherd, the flute to men who are in the fear of gods and intent on their idol worship. Such musical instruments must be excluded from our wineless feasts, for they are more suited for beasts and for the class of men that is least capable of reason than for men of God." Let's just leave that stuff alone. It has no part in our worship. Eusebius of Caesarea. "We render our hymn with the living psalterion and the living cithara with spiritual songs. The unison voices of Christians would be more acceptable to God than any musical instrument. Accordingly, in all the churches of God, united in soul and attitude, with one mind and an agreement of faith and piety, we send up a unison melody in words of the Psalms." Again, he's saying we sing. We don't use instruments in our worship. John Chrysostom, 347 to 407 AD. "David formerly sang songs. Also today we sing hymns. He had a lyre with lifeless strings. The church has a lyre with living strings. Our tongues are the strings of the lyre, with a different tone indeed, but much more in accordance with piety." Now, there's a whole bunch more of those church father quotes, like dozens of them. But we'll leave it at that so far as those. Let's move forward in time to some prominent denominational sources. And so Martin Luther, you may have heard of Martin Luther, right? He did not start a Lutheran church. It got started and named after him. He was separating from Catholicism, and rightly so, and sort of went to the other extreme in a lot of things. But anyhow, Martin Luther said the organ in worship is an insignia of Baal. He didn't look very highly upon instrumental music. The insignia of Baal. It is part of false worship. Joseph Bingham, 1600s to 1700s. "Music in churches is as ancient as the apostles, but instrumental music is not so." There's always been music in churches, but not instrumental. That's something that's new. John Wesley, the Wesleyan church, Methodist church, came out of John Wesley. "I have no objection to the organs in our chapels as long as they are neither seen nor heard." You can have them there, just don't let me see them and don't let me hear them, right? There's some really great quotes from these folks. There's just a whole host of men, John Calvin, Adam Clarke, Charles Spurgeon, and others, well-known and well-respected theologians who were adamantly opposed to the use of instrumental music. And it's not because they didn't like instruments. Adam Clarke said, "Music as a science I esteem and admire, but instruments of music in the house of God I abominate and abhor. It's just not to be." Well, why were they so adamant against it? Well, for the same reasons we've been talking about today. God said sing. They could read their Bibles. They understood what their Bibles were saying. There was a Presbyterian publication from the mid-1800s. It asked the question, is there any authority for instrumental music of God, in worship of God under the present dispensation? The answer was this: not the least. Only the singing of psalms and hymns and spiritual songs was appointed by the apostles. Not a syllable is said in the New Testament in favor of instrumental music, nor was it ever introduced into the church until after the 8th century, after the Catholics had corrupted the simplicity of the gospel by their carnal inventions. So I've given quotes from Baptists and Anglicans and Presbyterians and Lutherans and Methodists, and they were all in agreement. Sing. All of them. Now, today, go to Baptist churches, Anglican churches, Presbyterian churches, Lutheran churches, Methodist churches, keep on going down the list. And unfortunately, what you're going to see, what you're going to hear, is instrumental music. What happened? What happened? The people who were at the start of all that were opposed to it. What happened? Well, here's what happened. People left serious Bible study behind. And they turned worship into what feels good to them instead of what God said. And if we're talking about going to the ice cream shop, go ahead and pick whatever flavor you want. When we're talking about worship before God, you and I don't get to decide. We don't get to tell God how we're going to worship him. I get to read our Bibles and find out what God says and then put that into practice. When our worship is directed by our desires, it ceases to be about God. It's vain worship. Jesus talked about that kind of thing. Hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy about you, saying, these people draw near to me with their mouth and they honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. Friends, we need to stay away from the commandments of men because they do nothing to honor God. So why do we sing in worship with no instruments? It's as simple as God said so. That's why. And hopefully that's a good enough answer for us, because that ought to be the answer for everything we do in service of God, because God said so. God knows better than you and I. And so long as worship is going to be about exalting God, then we're going to do it that way. And the thing is, as soon as we stop doing it that way, it ceases to be about God. We bring a piano in here, we bring guitar or drums in here, and it's no longer about God, it's about us. It's about our desires and what we like and what makes us feel good. And we ought to feel good about worship. But we ought to feel good about worshiping God's way. Because when we start worshiping our way, guess who is no longer part of the worship? It's no longer about God. He's no longer listening. Remember in Luke chapter 18, Jesus talked about two men who went down to the temple to pray. One was a tax collector. He bowed down to the earth and, Lord, be merciful to me, a sinner. God listened to him. Other guy was a Pharisee. Pharisee was there telling God how great he was, not God, how great he, the Pharisee, was, and how fortunate God was to have him. And the way Jesus talks about it is he went there and he was praying with himself. He wasn't praying with God. He was praying with himself. You and I need to worship God in song the way he says, so that God is engaged in our worship. God is listening, God is focused, and God is glorified. And so let's do things God's way. All right, if we can help you in your walk with the Lord today, we want to do that. If we can encourage you in prayer or by the study of some scriptures, let us know what we need to open our Bibles up to. If we can help you by way of obedience to the gospel, if you're here and you have not become a child of God. The New Testament tells us that we need to believe, and there are a lot of churches tell us believe, and they stop there. Well, the Bible didn't stop there. We need to believe who Jesus is. We need to turn away from sin. We need to be willing to confess him before men. We need to be baptized for the forgiveness of our sins. And if you've not done all of that, then can I encourage you to do that and become a child of God today? It will be the best decision you ever make in your life, because it's a decision for heaven. And so let's make a decision for heaven. If we can help you in some way, let us stand together and sing.